I'm very happy to introduce Brent Waters. He is the director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values, and that's at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. And so the title of his presentation is a discussion of the theological and ethical points of creating gametes from stem cells. Thank you, Brent.
Even though I have the coveted after lunch slot, I'm going to read my paper because my wife is trying to convince me that I don't always have to say the first thing that pops into my head. When I first started thinking about this topic, some familiar words from Ecclesiastes came readily to mind. There is nothing new under the sun. This is not to say that there is nothing new about the prospect of synthetic gametes. Rather, that listening to the initial ethical debates produces a sense of déjà vu, echoes from previous quarrels over various technologies utilizing human embryos. To a large extent, I think my initial reaction is correct. If one is predisposed to being either troubled or accepting of these technological developments, I don't anticipate that synthetic gametes is going to change many minds. Nonetheless, it is a valuable exercise to revisit old battlefields before entering a new skirmish. There's always the possibility that an unexpected, game-changing insight might be gained. But more importantly, it offers an opportunity to stop and assess where we are, to see how far down a road we have already traveled and whether it is proving to be a route we wish to continue upon. Now for the customary disclaimer. I am a last-minute replacement, and I inherited the questions listed for this session. I will be addressing them, or at least most of them, in an oblique rather than direct manner. This is not because I think they are bad questions. They are very good questions, but I would have posed them a bit differently. My concern is not so much the ethics of synthetic gametes per se, but how they may be seen and evaluated as part of a cumulative process of related technological developments over the past decades. And more importantly, the corrosive tendencies they are driving within the broader culture. In other words, I want to try to step back and see how synthetic gametes fit into a larger picture. In the time remaining, I want to examine three of these tendencies. First, synthetic gametes, whether used for therapeutic or reproductive purposes, will help perpetuate the erosion of familial affinities or kinship. A family provides a place of unconditional, mutual, and timely belonging, particularly between parents and offspring. There is admittedly cultural variations regarding how families are structured or organized, but all share a strong intergenerational component in common. These generations are bound together through an intricate and interrelated web of biological and social affinities. It is within this web that most of the effective, physical, and educational needs of children are met or overseen. Moreover, except for spouses, a family is not a voluntary association, but one comprised of a given or imposed kinship. Or to invoke a theological metaphor, children are akin to gifts entrusted to the care of parents. Proponents may object that synthetic gametes actually strengthen familial affinities or kinship. If used for therapeutic purposes, they could help prevent genetically related illnesses and disabilities. And what loving parent would not want one more tool in providing her child with optimal health? If used for reproductive purposes, they merely establish or strengthen the biological bond between parent and child. If the desire is to have children of one's own, and that is presumably a good and healthy desire, then why oppose a technology that helps achieve this goal, particularly in cases of infertility? These assurances, however, are misleading. Therapeutic applications will exacerbate the tendency initiated by such techniques as fetal monitoring, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and the like, of making familial belonging conditional rather than unconditional. Increasingly, a child is admitted to a family only if or when he meets certain qualitative standards. Reproductive applications of synthetic gametes will further cloud the meaning of parenthood that was initiated with natural gamete donation, IVF, and surrogacy. If stem cells can purportedly be used to create sperm and eggs, then presumably one person could be the biological parents of one child, and a variety of other novel configurations would be possible. What or who exactly a parent and child is might be now radically in question. Eric Cohen's claim that synthetic gametes will be used to create orphans because their parents are dead embryos is a bit over the top. But his hyperbole serves to illustrate the confusion of familial roles and relationships that are resulting from increasing technological intervention into the reproductive process. In other words, just as a side note, it's interesting to note St. Augustine's objection to incest was initially the confusion of these familial roles. How could one person simultaneously be sibling and parent? And he said also, for social and political reasons, this is not a good idea because you get a kind of inbred communities, and this creates hostility between communities. He wants people out there mixing it up. It's only as almost after an afterthought he says, oh, and by the way, the prospect makes us blush. So one proposal for clarifying this parental confusion is to reduce parenthood to an act of will. John Robertson, or following John Robertson, a parent is an individual who commissions a reproductive project. And no safe technique should be prohibited in the commissioner pursuing the goal of obtaining a child. Consequently, it makes no difference whether sexual intercourse, IVF, surrogacy, adoption, or synthetic gametes are used, for they are only tools to be used in securing the outcome of a child, and a desirable one at that. Yet this effectively reduces the child to an artifact of the commissioner's will. The price of supposedly clarifying what a parent is in light of asserting greater technological control over reproductive outcomes is to discard the web of unconditional familial affinities in favor of so-called desirable and conditional outcomes. And the subsequent relationship between a creator and product is far different from that of a recipient entrusted with a gift. A child of one's own becomes a child one owns. More broadly, what happens to a culture over time when the succeeding generation is seen as an artifact of the preceding one, rather than as fellow creatures sharing a mutual and timely belonging? Second, synthetic gametes exacerbate the tendency to regard the human body as a resource to be exploited or plundered. I suspect that a proponent would interrupt me at this point and say something to the effect, now stop right there. I know where you're going, and it is a silly argument. The body is a wonderful source for promoting what is now routine health care. Am I really prepared to say that it is wrong to donate blood, bone marrow, organs, tissue, natural gametes, and the like? As a Christian, should I not rejoice when the lame walk, the blind see, health is restored, and the infertile are blessed with a child, regardless if the cause of such healing is medical rather than miraculous? The creation of synthetic gametes is simply another tool for providing better health care. And if I find the prospect of synthetic gametes troubling, then I must also be troubled by modern medicine. Now, there is much that can be granted to this objection. I have no desire to return to pre-modern medicine, and such practices as blood and organ donation are honorable displays of charity. But there are a couple of replies I would like to offer to my critic. Although the use of one body to promote the healing of another body is good, there is nonetheless a disturbing undertow to reduce the body to a collection of its component parts. And this reductionistic perception is accompanied by a growing sense of entitled access to these biological resources. If the person owning these parts no longer has a need for them, why waste them? Why not put them to good use elsewhere? Hence the subtle and growing moral approbation or stigma that is often placed upon individuals that are reticent to be donors, or proposals for opt-out rather than opt-in policies. A human being, however, is more than the sum of her individual parts. Blood is not merely fuel, and a heart is not just a pump. A cadaver is not simply a repository of biological material to be extracted, but the body of a dead person that should be respected as such. What is particularly disturbing about the prospect of synthetic gametes is that it carries this reduction down to another level, that of the underlying genetic information. We can now use stem cells to make the parts we need. This ability effectively strips what is produced from any bodily context whatsoever. We can now use biological material for any purpose we may assign to it. Using stem cells, for instance, we can create gametes and then use them for reproductive or non-reproductive purposes. This effectively creates a commodity that can be bought and sold. Consequently, the advent of synthetic gametes exacerbates a process already underway in which donation is giving way to exchange. We can already buy and sell blood, sperm, and eggs, rent wombs. Interesting slip, don't think. So let's start over, rent wombs, all right. And there are serious proposals for creating markets for organs. If more widespread applications of a synthetic germline is developed, should it be regarded as property and product? And if so, who owns it? And who should benefit from its commercial use? Are we not creating a biological resource, not unlike that of minerals and other raw material, that involves the payment of royalties for its extraction and the creation of marketable products? To reduce the human body to a biological resource should, at the very least, give us some pause, particularly in the case of synthetic gametes. For what will grow increasingly invisible is how nonchalantly we will use stem cells to create gametes that will be used to create and destroy embryos in order to achieve certain therapeutic or reproductive goals. It is the case, I think, of what's come to be called tunnel vision. You've become so fixated on what you're doing that you no longer pay attention to what the end result is. And in the case with synthetic gametes, I think that is one of my major concerns, is will we lose sight of what the means we must employ to achieve the ends? Now, I think much of this reductionistic tendency can be traced to a prevalent ambivalence about the human body. As late moderns, we both adore and abhor our bodies. We love our bodies because through their sensual apparatus, we experience and we enjoy the world. And given the amount of time and money we expend adorning, pampering, and sculpting them, we evidently love our bodies quite a lot. But we also hate our bodies, for they grow old, weak, and tired. And because of their inherent limitations, they often prevent us from doing the things we would like to do. Why didn't God give me the body of a Major League Baseball pitcher? This ambivalence leads to the third and final tendency I want to mention. The prospect of synthetic gametes is one more instrument to aid the late modern project of mastering nature and human nature. If our bodies, and more broadly nature, prevents us from doing what we want to do, then we should eliminate those restrictions that prevent us from doing what we will. And technology is the tool of choice in accomplishing this goal. This does not imply that humans should somehow preserve a pristine nature. We need to create habitats in which we might flourish. The biblical mandate of asserting dominion over and stewardship of creation requires some alteration and manipulation on our part, some tinkering, if you will. Adam and Eve, after all, were charged with the responsibility of tending a garden and not preserving a wilderness. This task of creating a suitable human habitat is captured rather nicely by Hannah Arendt's insistence that the world is not given, but is an artifact. We construct the worlds in which we live. This construction may be done well or it may be done badly, but it is our task and no one else's. This task, however, was traditionally earthbound, and she was alarmed with the launching of Sputnik. She wondered if this was the first step in, at least imaginatively, abandoning the earth, and worried what ill effects might devolve over time if the origin and sustenance in constructing the world grew increasingly irrelevant. Would some kind of Promethean conceit warp the moral imagination, thereby imperiling the task of making a good world in which men and women might flourish? Similarly, I don't think it is alarmist to ponder if the prospect of synthetic gametes is one more indication that we might be trying to leave the body behind in making ourselves more human or better than human. But it is an understanding of humanity in direct proportion to the power of its will, that in some sense our bodies are simply the prosthesis of our will. And in increasing this power, technology is deployed to purportedly overcome the limits of human finitude. This quest for greater mastery is not confined to medicine or biotechnology. We use information technology, for example, to overcome the constraints of time and place. We cannot be in two places at the same time, but with appropriate technologies, we can be in contact with various locations at the same time. The promise of technology is not that it can merely relieve the human condition, but that it can enhance it by overcoming natural limits. Likewise, with late modern medicine, medical care is no longer merely dedicated to treating and curing illness, or caring when curing cannot be achieved. It is also dedicated to prevention and enhancing physical and cognitive performance. We strive for greater longevity while trying to prevent a corresponding loss of strength and mental abilities as we grow older. And I don't know whoever said that the 60s are the new 40s, but it's a lie. Indeed, aging is now often referred to as a disease that can and should be treated. Each new medical breakthrough suggests that one more obstacle against the will has been removed, and the implication that more will be conquered in the future. The prospect of synthetic gametes exacerbates this trend and expectation. Infertility, an unavailable partner, or age need not prevent anyone from becoming a parent, from having a child of one's own, or so at least the implicit promise. This enterprise, however, entails transforming medicine from a moral practice that assists people in coming to terms and dealing with their finitude and mortality into a project to overcome them. Whether or not medicine in general, and synthetic gametes in particular, ever deliver this immodest promise is really not the issue. For this anticipation has already been etched upon the moral imagination of late moderns. and they mold their lives, their actions, and their expectations accordingly. And over time, the sheer pace of technological development and the accompanying moral and social changes prompt a constant altering of what is valued and how it is valued. Think how easily we have grown accustomed to changed mores and attitudes that only a few years or decades ago made us shiver. Or as I like to say, in the past, when we were talking about many issues, I used to lead my students to peer over the abyss. They would stare in, be horrified, and leap back. Now they stare in, shrug, and say, whatever. We simply do not have the time to understand, much less evaluate the new and novel, for there is always something novel and new, prompting in turn an endless and inevitable transvaluation of values. In the evocative words of George Grant, the coming to be of technology has required changes in what we think is good, in what we think good is, how we conceive sanity and madness, justice and injustice, rationality and irrationality, beauty and ugliness. As Christians, whenever we are blessed with those rare moments to pause and reflect upon the state and course of our late modern circumstances, we should keep in mind that we have no complaint with the practice of medicine and technology more broadly that enables better care and healing, that assists us in our task of exercising a limited dominion and stewardship. What gives us concern is when finitude and mortality are regarded as evils to be overcome rather than as normal conditions of being human. We are creatures that are created by a good God, and to be a creature requires one to be finite and mortal. Indeed, it was as a mortal creature that the Word was pleased to dwell among us. The recovery of an active faith and steadfast confidence in the Incarnation is especially pertinent at this time when its reversal is being undertaken to turn flesh into data. The prospect of synthetic gametes offers us one of those rare opportunities to pause and evaluate where we are and where we are headed as a technoculture, and to assess if we are heading in the right direction. George Grant was fond of quoting an old Spanish proverb. "Take what you want," said God. "Take it and pay for it." Particularly in respect to synthetic gametes, we need to take some time to be clear about what exactly we are taking and what we are paying. Thank you for your attention in the also dreaded slot after lunch. So I'll be happy to entertain comments or questions, and if not, then we can move along. So.